Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out for tonight's event and conversation. My name is Mike Bustamante. I'm an associate professor of history here at the University of Miami. I'm pleased to be joined by my colleague at the other end of our long stage, Antonio Mora, also from UM. We're going to be sharing moderating duties for tonight's conversation titled Investigating the Indefinite Detention of Mariel Refugees, a conversation on season 2 of NPR's White Lies. Let me set the stage briefly for tonight's conversation, and then I'll introduce our guests briefly. For 11 days in August 1991, 119 Cuban refugees from the Mariel boatlift, incarcerated in Talladega, Alabama, held federal prison officials hostage to protest their imminent deportation to Cuba. This incident followed even larger uprisings at prisons in Georgia and Louisiana in 1987, among Cubans who had been deemed excludable from the United States and indefinitely detained ever since. So in season 2 of the Pulitzer Prize finalist NPR podcast, White Lies, investigative journalists Andrew Beck Grace and Chip Brantley work backwards from these crises to explore the unfolding of the Mariel boatlift, Mariel migrants' struggles to navigate the U.S. immigration and criminal justice systems, and the ways such challenges were deeply inflected by politics in general, national politics, the politics of immigration, and the politics of race. So our goal tonight is to have an interactive conversation with the creators of the show and a number of other invited experts and guests about Mariel, about Mariel's complex afterlives, about comparative U.S. immigration policy then and now, and the power of the podcast form for investigative reporting and storytelling. So I'm pleased to be joined by a very distinguished group of guests. I think when you all checked in, you should have gotten a sheet that has their full bios, so I won't read them out in detail. I'll just introduce them briefly. First and foremost, we're joined by Andrew Beck Grace and Chip Brantley, co-creators of White Lies. Thank you guys for making the trip down from not DC. I'm just thinking NPR DC. No, from
DC South.
DC South, exactly. Yeah. Thank you guys. We're also thrilled to have with us Danny Rivero. Danny is a reporter for WLRN, also the creator of his own podcast called Detention by Design, that similarly looks at the history of immigrant detention in the early 1980s, particularly cases of Haitians vis-a-vis Cubans around Mariel and other kinds of events. So it's a wonderful compliment. Thank you, Danny, for joining us. We're also pleased to have Brianna Noficiel. Brianna Noficiel is assistant professor of history at William & Mary College. For us here at UM, we also know her as a former dissertation fellow at our Cuban Heritage Collection. She's working on a wonderful book on the long history of immigrant detention in United States history, so she can offer some wonderful comparative perspective. Last but not least, we're joined by Mirta Ojito. Mirta is an award-winning journalist, currently with Telemundo, has taught at the Columbia School of Journalism, and has a number of interesting connections to the story this evening. She herself came to the United States during the Mariel boatlift as an adolescent, wrote a wonderful memoir about that experience called Finding Mañana that I recommend to all of you. She's also a featured voice on this season of White Lies, the White Lies podcast. And I think as hopefully she'll get to tell us a little bit about one of her first reporting gigs was reporting on one of these incidents at a prison with Mariel detainees. I want to acknowledge the co-sponsorship of a number of institutions inside and outside the university for making tonight's event possible. First, I'm very grateful to the Cuban Heritage Collection, to Amanda, to Annie, to everyone over there, and the wider UM Libraries team. Thank you for your support. We've been very lucky, thanks to Danny's help in part, to count on WLRN's co-sponsorship. So thank you to WLRN, our beloved local NPR affiliate. And finally, we're grateful to also count on the support from the School of Communication. The Cosford Cinema, where we sit, is a School of Communication facility. So thank you guys for making this possible. I'm sorry, I've forgotten to introduce Antonio. Antonio is an award-winning journalist. Many of you may know him from a long career on ABC, and he's teaching here at the University of Miami in the School of Communication. So thank you, Antonio, for joining us, and forgive me. Forgive me. I mentioned the School of Communications support. We're grateful for co-sponsorship also from the Center for Global Black Studies here at UM, and finally the Immigration Law Clinic at the School of Law. So I think to get the conversation going, we have a clip from the show that I think can sort of help set the stage for what this whole podcast is all about. I don't know if you guys want to introduce it briefly or just sort of launch right into it.
Yeah, thank you all for being here. We really appreciate it. Actually, we were going to bring something from the very first episode, but it kind of takes a little while to lean into the first episode. So instead, we're going to play the trailer for the show, which I think gives a pretty good sense of the overall scope of what we're looking for here, and begins in a very similar fashion as the first episode. So I think that's the first clip.
Great. So I think we have the clip ready.
Before we found the man in Vancouver, before we sued the State Department, before we snuck into the graveyard of the federal penitentiary, and before we received the brown paper package that changed everything, all we had were the photographs.
We come across them in a newspaper archive. Photos from a prison takeover in 1991 in rural Alabama. Men standing on the roof of that prison, holding a bedsheet that said, "Pray for us." And the strangest thing about these photos, all the men on the roof were from Cuba.
1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. I got a message to the public opinion of the United States.
Who were these men on the roof? What in the world had brought them from Cuba to a prison in rural Alabama, and what had happened to make them want to take it over?
No, he just said it was our only option. We had to do something, and this was the only thing we could think of.
Even though we were hostage and they threatened us and everything, they still treated us with dignity and respect.
They're not being held because they're charged with a crime. These people were being indefinitely detained. You can't just keep these people in jail until they die.
In many cases, we never heard back from them. It was like if the earth had swallowed them. We came to understand that the story was about a lot more than a prison takeover in Alabama. It was instead a sprawling story of a mass exodus across the sea, back-channeled Cold War communiques, family separation, and a secret list.
This man just read our names, all of our names, and then he said, "There's a boat waiting for you, get everybody."
There was a continuing concern that Fidel Castro is emptying his jails and forcing boat captains to take undesirables to the United States.
They get out of their boats and they walk through the water, and they're yours. What do you do with them?
Searching for them under the roof, we'd find a story about our history, about our laws, and about our ideals. A story about who has the right to have rights in this country.
Those people are illegally in this country. They can, by law, be confined by the Attorney General indeterminately.
They were sent here with a label. And you know what we did? We accepted the label.
This isn't right. What our government is doing in our name is not right.
You can think of a nation as a place with a border, a set of laws, a flag, some people. But really, a nation needs a story to tie the whole thing together. So what to do then about the inconvenient parts of a nation's past? The parts that call the whole thing into question.
This season, we find them in the roof. We tell a story about how sometimes it's the lies that bind us together.
I hope one day to go back to the United States. I left my daughter when she was 4 years old. I don't see my daughter anymore.
Coming January 26th from NPR, it's season 2 of White Lies.
Riveting stuff. You guys might have noticed the voice of Rudy Giuliani there. I picked it out. Bit of a spoiler alert. How did you guys get to this story? Why Talladega 1991? Why the longer saga of Mariel and Detention? Which came first?
It's funny being here in Miami today and being with you all to realize the Anglo gaze that our story has on this story that's very different here in Miami. It's just embedded in your history. And I think in many ways what happened to us, we're based in Alabama, we're journalists, we're interested in sort of deeper contextual stories about American history. And we found these photographs, literally these photographs of what had happened in Talladega. And neither one of us growing up in Alabama had ever heard about this prison takeover. It was just a very peculiar thing. And the minute that we started digging into it, of course, we realized that there was this massive riot that had happened in Atlanta and in Oakdale, and that the plight of these Mariel Cubans had been going on for a decade by the time they arrived in Talladega. But the fact that that we had proximity to the story in Talladega was very interesting to us. Mm-hmm. And I think what initially happened was we decided to sort of report it out. And so we talked to Cynthia Corzo, who's in the audience, and some reporters that had covered it and found some hostages and started talking to them. And one in particular, whose voice you hear in the trailer, this kind of Stockholm syndrome moment where she says, we were a hostage and they threatened us, but they also treated us with dignity and respect. Her name's Linda Calhoun. And she was literally one of the first interviews we did. She lives in Atlanta. And her sense of empathy for the plight of these men who had taken her hostage was incredibly it created something in us, this like deeper sense of curiosity about what had really happened. Who were these people? What had really happened to them? And then, as you dug into it, realizing that it was very hard to understand what had happened to these people because 2,746 of them, their names were on this secret list that the government had created in 1984, and that those people, the majority of them, had been deported back to Cuba. And besides the existence of 2 or 3 articles where journalists from this country had gone down to talk to them, very little was known about what actually happened to these folks. So I think that was enough. Those were the sort of elements for us to kind of be very curious about what kind of story could be told here. And then to, like Brianna's work, for instance, realizing that the history of immigration detention is embedded in these moments too, that the Reagan administration's approach to immigration was in many ways forged through what happened to the Mariel detainees. Mm-hmm. So I think all those things in combination just made us think this is a story worth pursuing, which is why we started pursuing it 7 years ago. So
maybe I could go to Chip. I mean, and you've already started answering this question, but tell us a little bit more about the reporting journey, right? My sense is that this is you started this project actually before the research that was season 1 of White Lies, if I'm not mistaken. So
we did. So we're inefficient. Is that what you're getting at?
No, you're just thoughtful and methodical.
Yeah, that's right.
But what I mean, this research I think has taken you to many different places, and obviously you've put in a ton of hours and into it. What was sort of the path from these initial interviews? What were some of the biggest challenges along the way?
Yeah, I mean, Andy alluded to this, but I think, when you start a story like this, and we literally started with these photos we found in the Birmingham News photo archives, Birmingham News, which as of yesterday ceased to exist. So the newspaper formerly known as the Birmingham News used to have in downtown Birmingham, where I live, a big building with all of its photos from 120 or whatever years in it. And all the negatives for those photos were in filing cabinets, so you could sort of go through chronologically. And we were looking for something else, and we found these packets of negatives that Andy said, alluded to, that said Cubans take over federal prison, a Cuban uprising at Talladega. And honest to God, neither of us knew that there was a federal prison in Talladega, which is its own problem, but we had no memory of this event. And so I think starting with these photos, and they're all pretty bad photos, frankly, because, apologies to any photographers in the room, the Bureau of Prisons and the Department of Justice had kept these photographers at something like a quarter mile away from the prison, so they couldn't get up close, and the prisoners couldn't interact with any of the media of the prisoners. I'm falling into the trap that we all fall into, but call them the prisoners, the detainees, the men who are being detained there at Cuba. At Talladega, they didn't want them to be able to interact with the media in any way. And so the fact that these photos were taken from so far away and that you couldn't really discern anything from them was intriguing. Mm-hmm. And then, as Andy mentioned, it just so happened that the very first people we talked to to try to figure out what was going on in the story, this hostage, Linda Calhoun, one of the attorneys in Atlanta, who some of you here, this name will ring a bell, Gary LaShaw, who was very active in representing many of these detainees in Atlanta throughout the 1980s. Cynthia, Mirta, Rafael Peña-Ver, these people whose names we came across, who we talked to, who were so interesting and were able to articulate the core issues in the story so well that, and this happens, I think, with any story in a small way, and in our case, this happened in a big way, that you start with these simple photos, these sort of flattened photos of this event that seem like a prison uprising, which, it's not common, but doesn't the most uncommon thing in the world. And then it just opens up this entire world below it that goes back to Mariel and even further.
Yeah. So maybe we could zoom out a little bit to just kind of frame a bit of the context about Mariel itself, because that is the origin point in so many ways for the story that you guys tell. And I want to turn to Mirta. Mirta, as I mentioned, you came to the United States as an adolescent during the Mariel boatlift. If you could try to encapsulate, in a few words, what led to the Mariel boatlift? What was it? Who came? And how did the U.S. government, the Carter administration, respond?
Sure, thank you. Thank you for inviting me. So what led to the boatlift was the situation that had been present in Cuba pretty much since 1959. That's sort of the broad picture. But specifically, it was, I contend, the return of the Cuban exiles who were in Miami and other places and who returned to Cuba in 1979 to see their relatives. That created, and they left as gusanos and came back as butterflies or mariposas, because they suddenly, even though they were so-called traders, they were able to buy things for their relatives, for their families. In fact, stores were open for them, special stores that we didn't have access to. We, the so-called revolutionaries that have been in Cuba and have been sacrificing ourselves, didn't have the right to go to the stores and had to wait for this gusanos turned mariposas to buy for us. So there was clearly the issue of hypocrisy and then the issue of lies, because many of our relatives, many people exaggerated, and there are plenty of stories about that. But most people that I encountered did not exaggerate. They were working class people who worked in factories in Hialeah, or who taught, or who had, menial jobs, and had been able to save a little money and were very, very happy to return to Cuba and see their relatives. And they brought, some of them brought very expensive gifts, but the majority did not. Certainly my uncle and my aunts brought gifts, but it was a large family and we got one each. So it wasn't like suitcases of gifts. But the gift that they gave us was the gift of the truth. They told us the stories that we were eager to hear. And these were stories about, yes, you have to work very hard, but the possibilities are endless, and it's all on you. And that was a very, very powerful message to hear. So a lot of people became desperate and decided, I want to have what they have. Not only, it was not just the concept of freedom as a faraway sort of philosophical idea. It was a very tangible thing that told you, yes, you can have freedom and you can also buy a car and go to Disney World. So all of that was a very powerful message. People became desperate. Nobody was giving visas at that time in Spain for certain people, but that was a very difficult process. And you had to have someone who did whatever they had to do to get you that visa, to get you out of the country. So people who didn't have relatives outside of Cuba did what was sort of, in many ways, easiest, but at the same time more complicated and dangerous, which was to break into embassies, and many people did that. And of course, the most notable one was the Peruvian embassy in April of 1980, where a bus driver, along with 5 other people, went into the embassy, and the ambassador who was there at the time refused to turn those people over to the Cuban government. The Cuban government then retired, withdrew all security from the embassy, and you know the story. More than 10,000 people crowded the gardens of the embassy. And that became a huge international crisis then. How do you get rid of those people? And that, long story, it's what led to the boatlift.
Yeah, thank you so much for distilling a lot of history in a very, very brief time. There's lots to say, more we could say, I'm sure, about the origins of Mariel and its unfolding. Turning to Brianna and sort of the U.S. response, right? The Carter administration, when this crisis began to unfold, famously at one point said, we're going to welcome the Cuban refugees with open arms, right? This quickly became a very complicated, politically moment for the Carter administration. And detention policies, right, sending these refugees into some kind of confinement was part of the response from the start in some ways. Can you tell us a little bit about sort of the landscape of immigrant detention as it was being applied to Mariel, maybe what it looked like before and sort of how Mariel kind of changed the game?
Yeah, so the U.S. has detained immigrants for as long as we've had immigration laws. It's always been kind of part of how our laws have been enforced. The landscape of this changes really dramatically in the 1950s. There are these quite high-profile detentions of European immigrants who are detained a really long time. It makes people very uncomfortable. And the U.S. very loudly proclaims that they are going to end immigration detention, that it is not compatible with America's values. And they say we're only going to use it in the most exceptional circumstances. We're only going to use it when migrants pose a threat to the United States, which of course in itself is like a remarkably vague thing to say. So this promise that we've ended immigration detention is never a kind of true promise, but we really start to see how shallow it is in the 1970s when Haitian asylum seekers start arriving in South Florida in quite large numbers, and they are pretty much uniformly sent to jail. And this is a remarkable sort of rejection of what the US has claimed, right? They've claimed they're not going to detain except in the most exceptional circumstances, and now we're taking this entire group of people and sending them to jail. And racism undercuts this kind of entire story, but it's also a story about, the US imagined asylum working in a really specific way. They imagined people waiting in refugee camps for the US to send for them. They did not anticipate people showing up at the US's borders and claiming asylum. So it's, in many ways like an incredible failure of imagination, our refugee law. So when the Cubans show up, they check several boxes that the Haitians don't. Most notably, they're coming from a communist country, so that fits the US's Cold War narrative much more neatly. But they face major challenges as well. They similarly sort of tap into this anxiety that the US is out of control of its borders. This isn't what we thought asylum was going to look like. And then there's the sort of shadow hanging over all of this, which is that Castro says, I've opened my prisons. These people are not just your relatives and your loved ones, they are the prisoners of society, and it's up to you to figure out who's who, basically. So this sort of opens the door for detention. The government was already kind of flirting with detention in the 70s, but now they have a rationale, right? They say, well, we got to figure out who's who. And the only way for us to do that is through detention. So it kind of, they walked through a door that was already open. They were already interested in reintegrating detention into kind of the arsenal of border control. And in a way, Mariel gives them a good opportunity to expand incarceration's use.
Yeah, and so we see, there's this weird thing about Mariel where it almost seems to me kind of like this hybrid response. There are, especially early on, folks who arrive and yes, are sort of in federal custody of one kind or another, but are sort of processed out relatively quickly, especially if they have relatives. But if you didn't have family sponsorship, that became a huge impediment. And so we see the opening of sort of longer term detention facilities, places like Fort Chaffee, Fort McCoy in Wisconsin, Fort Indiantown Gap, Eglin Air Force Base, and I think a couple of others. Brianna started to mention this question of kind of stigma, right? Or you were alluding to it, and this question of Castro emptying his jails and sort of this wonderfully powerful phrase that was in the trailer that we heard, that the Cuban government placed a label on folks and kind of we ended up adopting it, right? You spent a lot of time in one of the early episodes of the show sort of trying to suss out, sort of truth from fiction in this whole question of prisons and the emptying, quote unquote, of psychiatric facilities, right? And I think really make a compelling case that while there's undeniable evidence that some of that happened, this became sort of blown out of proportion in the public discourse. And maybe you guys could talk about that sort of question of stigma and trying to find the truth, and some of your work to sort of analyze the media's own role in sort of perpetuating some of that stigma.
Yeah, that was one of the biggest questions. Our show is called White Lies. The first season of our show is about an unsolved civil rights era murder, and it's really about the culpability of whiteness to some degree. So I think we felt maybe implicated in the way that the story of Mariel Cubans had been told in the national media, and we're really curious to try to understand that in a more systematic and holistic way. So as many of you probably already know, about a third of the boat lift were Afro-Cuban, darker skinned folks. These are single people that were coming, not like family groups that had been coming at the end of when the revolution happened and the first wave of Cuban immigrants and Cuban exiles. So they were demographically different. A lot of single men, regardless of their skin color, just in general, working class people that didn't have the same kind of education that most of the first wave Cuban immigrants had attained by the time they came to the United States. So there was a lot of inborn stigma that already existed in this country when they arrived. And there really is, I mean, we phrase it as a sort of, and I think we have a clip of this, but like there's a switch that is flipped. I mean, early coverage of the boat lift is here in Miami, the largest charity drives the city had ever seen of the Cuban-American community coming out to donate whatever they could, this sense that we're going to bring back all of our family members. And within a week and a half or so, the first boats come that don't have family members aboard, but instead, in fact, the story of the America in particular was chartered by a group of Cuban-Americans, first wave Cuban-Americans, and not a single person who came back was a relative of any of those folks that had chartered it. And I think that story, which was on the cover of the New York Times, it led every single newscast that night, it begins to be the place where there's a changing narrative about who these people really are. And then, as the media often does, we were probably implicated in this as well, that interesting and sort of compelling narrative, because it's a narrative of a shift, right? Mm-hmm. So we think we understand something one way, but now here's proof that it's actually the opposite. It almost overwhelms the reality of the situation. And yes, there might have been people in the America that came from maybe some mental institutions, maybe some prisons, but what had those folks done in Cuba? What had gotten them there in the first place? And how was the regime in Cuba actually weaponizing, as some people have said, the boat lift itself to seed these doubts? So I think that's one of the big things that we sort of wanted to investigate in the show. Yeah, and I think you guys have a clip, if I'm not mistaken, that kind of sets that up or kind of covers that. I think it's an okay moment maybe to go there. So I think we can play the second clip, Renee. Sorry to catch Renee a little bit unawares.
This is all falling apart.
So these are photos from the boat lift.
Oh, yeah. These pictures, that's my dad in Mariel. You see the background?
Yeah, that is a lot of boats. Hold on.
Well, we were boat number 50.
To get down
to
there?
arrive.
We've come to the city of South Miami to see Marta Carbonell. A few doors down, the peacock strolls in a neighbor's yard. Marta was born in Cuba, in the city of Mariel, actually. Her father was the mayor of the town before the revolution. She was baptized in the church there. She remembers her grandfather's sisal farm on the outskirts of town. Her parents left shortly after the revolution, and so Marta mostly grew up in Florida, in the exile community.
That's my dad's boat. That was the boat's maiden voyage. This boat wasn't ready. It was a Bertram he had ordered, so it was almost done. It wasn't even outfitted properly. And I remember being in the office with him, and I had my dress and my heels, and he said, somebody just called me, there's going to be a boat lift or something's going on.
So Marta grabbed some clothes, some boat shoes, and all the canned goods she had in the house. They were going to take the brand new 46-foot Bertram to Mariel to try and bring Marta's grandfather to the U.S.
That says, okay, hop on in, and we took off. But before we took off, my dad said, I'm going to ask permission. And he said, I'm going to talk to the head of the Truman Annex, the military or Coast Guard person. And he says, I want permission to go get my father. And the officer said, I cannot give you permission, but I give you my blessing. And I heard that. And he said, we have the blessing, let's go. So we left.
They spent a few weeks in Mariel Harbor waiting, and finally the grandfather showed up. But Marta's father wasn't allowed to leave without taking 40 additional people.
Who were the 40 other people?
You don't know. It could be people from the jails. They emptied their jails, they emptied their mental institutions. You don't know what you're going to get or what. So you put those at the bottom, and so you can see them. You go to the flying bridge because you don't know who you're bringing or what their intentions are.
don't know who you're bringing or what their intentions are. This sort of suspicion about who was being loaded onto their boats was something that every boat captain we talked to remembered feeling. As these boats returned to Key West, American reporters like Mimi Whitefield were there to greet them.
There was a very large ship. Its name was America, and its impending arrival was talked about for weeks and weeks before it ever got there. Cuba sort of, I think, said, okay, America, you know, you want these people with open hearts and open arms. This is what we're going to send you.
The America had been chartered by a group of Cuban exiles in Miami to pick up 484 relatives.
Yesterday, the America returned with 700 refugees, none of them relatives of the people who chartered the boat.
The choice that we were given by the Cuban government once we entered the port was that we had to leave with 600 political and common prisoners.
When that ship, the America, arrived, it was abundantly clear that there was a conscious decision on the part of the Cuban authorities to sort of salt these voyages with people that they wanted to get rid of.
The America arrived just a few weeks into the boat lift, days after President Carter announced the U.S. would welcome the refugees with an open heart and open arms. And the story of the America was taken by many as confirmation. Castro was emptying his jails. And it wasn't just in South Florida. It was on the front page of the New York Times and led national newscasts that night. And it seems to be here, at this moment, that the perception of the boat lift shifted. It's like a switch was flipped. The Mariel Cubans were no longer being talked about as refugees seeking freedom, but instead as common criminals and vagrants being dumped by Castro onto U.S. soil. In fact, years later, a study in the Miami Herald's coverage of the boat lift showed that for the first weeks, the stories were generally positive. But in the last week of May, negative characterizations of the Cubans in the boat lift made up 90% of the paper's Mariel coverage.
Mike, if I could add something to that.
Please.
Yes, the day that ship arrived was the day I arrived from Cuba, which was May 11, 1980. And that wasn't the only ship that was expected. The other ship was the Valley Chief. The other ship, which was the ship in which I was supposed to come from Cuba. But it broke down, so it never arrived. So everyone focused on the one that did arrive. And I just want to read to you the headline of the New York Times on May 11th. Retarded people and criminals are included in Cuban exodus. That was the headline of a story by Edward Schumacher on May 11th, 1980. I can't imagine the paper running such a headline now for any exodus. But that was on the front page, center story above the fold of the Times. And as I said, it was that day that changed everything. The Miami Herald had an editorial days later saying enough.
Yeah, yeah. I just encourage everyone to listen to that episode because I forget which episode that is, episode 3, because you guys do such a wonderful job showing how varied the estimates numerically were and trying to, and I think do some really wonderful work to sort of get the truth and suss out what it meant to be in prison in Cuba in the 1970s, right? We need to think about that critically. I want to turn to Danny, who's been sitting quietly and patiently. Danny, as I mentioned in the intro, you've recently produced your own podcast for WLRN, Detention by Design, that highlights the importance of understanding these detention policies toward Cubans in the context of Mariel against a wider backdrop of what's happening, some of what Brianna started to mention. Why for you is it important to sort of locate this story of Mariel also in that broader perspective vis-a-vis what's happening with Haitian refugees in the years leading up to Mariel and then really at the same time?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Thanks everyone for coming. One of the podcasts I produced with WLRN, Detention by Design, it's kind of sprawling. Like it starts in the 60s-ish, and then it goes up through, the 80s-ish, and then it jumps ahead to today. But the reason to start in the 70s was, what I was trying to do is get an understanding of why we have the systems that we have. Like, why do we do the things we do as a country? And the Mariel boat lift is one of those things that it's a big shiny object because it was a very big deal international situation and it was very public. Castro was making statements, Carter had to respond, very top level situation. So a lot of people's brains go straight to that. but once I started looking into it, it was a big splash in a pool that was already, there was already water being thrown around, and a lot of that was Haitian migration. Haiti had a brutal dictatorship, Papa Doc and then later Baby Doc, and I don't think Miami as a place appreciates how brutal that dictatorship was. I mean, they had laws on the books that when the militias killed someone, you could not remove the body from the streets. You had to leave the body there. I mean, we can't even fathom how brutal that place was. But they were friendly with the US in the Cold War. They were anti-communist. So there was a very heavy Cold War dynamic between, and it especially becomes apparent when Mariel happens, is how you have people, the Archbishop of Miami, Thomas Wensky, in the podcast, he says, you have people fleeing the same place, the Caribbean, for ultimately similar reasons. They're fleeing dictatorships, but one's from the right and one's from the left, and you treat them completely differently. And I emphasize in the podcast, like, there's a very large scale narrative with what happened with people who came through the Mariel boatlift. A lot of them were processed. Some of them were sent to Fort Chaffee or other places. They had issues. It was not easy. But in the end, the majority of them were released. And what happened with a lot of Haitians starting in the mid-70s is they did not have that story. I mean, a lot of them, they would come in, similar set of circumstances, fleeing brutality, and they were detained. It was like trying to find a way to get them to remove themselves from the situation voluntarily. And, and interestingly enough, one of the main, well, I think we have a clip here, but I'll just intro it a little bit. But one of the biggest players, and Brianna's in the podcast too, and she talks about this in there, in this whole situation, which is still around today, is the Chrome Avenue Detention Center. And one of the characters I had, Rafael, in the podcast, who came through Mariel, he tells me, he said, I came in through Key West, they sent us on a bus, they put us in Chrome for about a day, processed me. In a week, I was working as a busboy in Miami. So Chrome was set up as kind of a center to get people oriented and then get them out. But let's listen to the clip now.
Yeah.
Soon after Judge Shube ended the hearing.
That's not the one.
That's not the wrong.
The court concludes that the first.
Sorry, that's not the one.
Chrome began as a provisional camp. It was just something temporary because they thought, it's a little. Chrome began as a provisional camp. It was just something temporary because they thought, it's a little like this coronavirus thing today. Yeah, this is a temporary thing. This is something that's going to be with us for years, generations maybe. And they thought that this was just kind of a fluke wave, but they didn't realize that this was going to now be the beginning, really, of a whole architecture of stopping, housing, imprisoning, monitoring, and discouraging immigrants. And the Haitians were really the first ones.
So that was Kim Ives, a journalist working out of New York, covers Haiti. And those last words that he says, the Haitians were really the first ones, it's something that stuck with me. It was one of the very early interviews I did. And the Chrome Center really starts operating as an immigration-oriented space during the Mariel boatlift, right? It's this place where people get processed and whatnot. But what happened is, while the Mariel boatlift was happening, there was tens of thousands of Haitians who were also coming. There were overlapping waves of migration by boat to Florida. And once Mariel kind of wound down, it was what, 7 months, 9 months? I forget exactly. But once it wound down, the Haitians were still coming. So what are you gonna do with the Haitians? They took the facility that they built as kind of this temporary space, and they started just housing them there, keep them there. And there was a series of lawsuits. I mean, this is by the time that Reagan came into office, and he came in basically with, we're not gonna be like Jimmy Carter, right? We're gonna be harder on this. And they were. So they started essentially detaining people indefinitely in Chrome and in other facilities across the country. They built a prison and a military base in Puerto Rico, sent thousands of Haitians there. And there was a lawsuit at some point, and I talked to the attorneys out of here in the Gables, Ira Kurzban, and he sued the federal government several times, and he took them to the Supreme Court and whatnot, and they actually got the numbers of like who is being detained in the United States. And it was almost entirely Haitians, like over 90%. I can't remember the people that were not Haitians were probably, but it was a moment that everything changed from that point on. And Mariel was an important part of it, but it was not the most important part of it, because the first people that were not, this subset of these people that were marked in a secret list, that these people cannot be allowed in. It was the first time, this was general practice in the United States, is with the Haitians. And it happened at the same time as the Mariel boatlift, essentially. And, it also, like, just the Mariel boatlift, it was before I was born, to be honest, but just reading back through it, it's really a remarkable place for Miami as a city. It's like in the creation of Miami as a place. It's there was a ballot initiative that was started, and I talk about it in the podcast. Once all the fears of like, who are these people? They're coming to our city. We don't know who they are. We're scared of them. There was a ballot initiative. It was not the politicians. It was the community. They organized it to make Miami monolingual, English only, right? Cubans did not have political power back then. And Cubans were not happy about that. And the backlash to that, Cuban political power came, right? But it was a very pivotal moment for immigration policy as a country and also for a city, so.
Yeah. It's why the comparison between what's happening to Cubans in 1980 or around 1980 in Haitians, I think, is so important, but also so challenging, right? Because the way that Cubans are being treated by the immigration system after Mariel looks very different and harsher than what they had experienced to that point. And particularly when you look at the fate of those who were deemed excludable for a series of questionable reasons.
What they would experience afterwards, too. I mean, what's sort of amazing about Mariel is that you have this, and it's largely because of the Haitians. That because of the concurrent wave of migrants, the Carter administration looks at who's arriving from Mariel, looks at the coverage, looks at the public perception, looks at the Haitians, who they're already detaining, and they already find, because of their dark skin, because of where they're coming from, they're already cool with that. And they think, well, we can't treat these folks from a communist nation who heretofore we've had incredible refugee policy for. We can't treat them different. They're all showing up in boats to South Florida at the same time. Yeah. And so they make this special dispensation, the Cuban-Haitian entrant status pending, which is the legal definite, or the legal designation of their entrant status. And they do that on the backs of these 50s that Brianna was talking about, these 50s immigration laws that were created that essentially said a non-citizen whom we cannot send back, we don't have any responsibility for that person. They're no more ours than theirs, is actually what the Supreme Court ruling says in the Mazzei case. And so it becomes this very interesting, and it really is largely because of the racial dynamics of the Haitians who are coming, that the Mariel Cubans get treated in the way that they do in terms of immigration. At least that's our read on what's happening at that moment.
Brianna, I see you sort of like with the mic creeping up. I didn't know if you wanted to chime in here. No, okay. Let's sort of get back to the kind of central arc of the story before we then we want to have a conversation too with Antonio about podcasting. But obviously, what you're trying to do in going through all this history is sort of get back to 1991 and this event that you begin with, right? You talk about how these refugee camps, first on military bases, became sort of warehouses, for lack of a better term, for those Mariel refugees who by, say, late 80, 81, even into 82, I think, are not, they can't be sponsored, or they're being deemed to be excludable under U.S. immigration law because of a suspected criminal background or other kinds of things. But part of what is just so evocative in the last episode that aired is the history of the activism and the legal work, similar to what Danny was referencing in the case of Haitians, that starts to be done on their behalf. I don't know if you guys can talk a little bit about tracking that, and then I know we have a final clip from the show that we want to play.
Yeah, so a couple of people have mentioned the wave of Mariel Cubans, tens of thousands over the first few months. There's just the processing has to take place elsewhere, the U.S. government determines. So they send them to these military bases. Fort Chaffee in Arkansas being the main one where people are consolidated over time. And in the meantime, they're detaining people in federal prisons, people who are suspected of having criminal backgrounds in Cuba, people who admit to having served time in prison, in a prison in Cuba. And then botched INS translations, all sorts of things. Everything you can imagine that could go wrong with a bureaucratic process like that goes wrong. And the U.S. starts sending them first to Talladega, Alabama, which has just been built, a new prison, and eventually consolidate them in a federal prison in Atlanta, Georgia, which, unlike Talladega, which had just been built, was about to be closed before Mariel. The Atlanta prison had actually, I can't remember when was it, we always get this date wrong, like 1902, opened in 1902, was the most dangerous federal prison in the country. Many people claim into the 70s, and he's particularly fond of this one Atlanta Journal-Constitution headline that is, what was it, death is part of life, Atlanta Pen. I mean, just macabre stuff. It's falling apart, it's overcrowded. Basically, leading up to Mariel, the Department of Justice decides to close the prison. They're going to close it because it's just so bad. And so they start moving prisoners out, and then Mariel happens. And so they decide, we have all this empty space in this prison, let's just send them there. And they say, the U.S. government says, we're going to keep trying to sponsor people out, but the people that we're suspect of, let's just send them to Atlanta. And so you have all sorts of different stories about how people end up in Atlanta. And into 1982, when the last refugee resettlement camp closes, Fort Chaffee, the remaining refugees there, in the hundreds, 300 to 500 refugees who are still seeking sponsorships, are transferred to Atlanta. Their custody is actually transferred from the Department of Health and Human Services to the Department of Justice, and so they're sent to this federal prison. Again, all they've done is come to this country and are seeking to be sponsored out and start a life here. And now they're in what was, 3 years before, the most dangerous federal prison in the country. So throughout the 1980s, you have thousands of Mariel Cubans who are coming through the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. And there's just no real constituency for them at first. It falls on the basically on the shoulders of the Atlanta Legal Aid Society, which is the Legal Aid Society of Atlanta that represents indigent clients in civil suits. And so they start trying to go in and start trying to represent these Mariel Cubans. They recruit some attorneys and others from Miami, including Rafael Peñalver, who's here in the audience, who start trying to advocate on behalf of these people who are being detained. And I think the one other major advocate that these Cuban detainees had in Atlanta was a federal district judge, Marvin Shube, who had been appointed in '79 by Carter, was new to the bench, but very quickly kind of became known as this, what many people said is like the sort of the prototypical Article III judge, someone who's just has a lifetime appointment and can sort of operate on his own moral compass without having to fear partisan politics and public opinion. So these two advocates, Judge Marvin Shube and the Atlanta Legal Aid Society, really kind of came in as these Moreau Cubans were languishing year after year in Atlanta.
And just to set this clip up, the sort of, we described it in the show, but before the sequence, the sort of Hail Mary pass that the attorneys tries, the most basic thing ever, the habeas corpus, right? Like, bring us the body. And it's used to bring this man, Genaro Soro Gonzalez, out of detention to basically have a hearing before the judge. What is this man being held for? And we go into pretty great detail in this particular episode before the part we're about to hear about all the back and forth that the judge hears about why this man, who really essentially was being held because of a translation mistake, been held for over a year at that point, why he was being held. So that's kind of the...
It's worth saying, sorry, one more time. We're going to give you all the context you need to hear this clip until you don't have to hear the clip anymore because you'll have heard the whole story. But the federal government's position was that these people weren't in the country. Their legal argument was that they were floating off the coast of Key West. Their bodies were not in the country, and therefore you couldn't give them due process. They weren't eligible for due process because they weren't here, and that was an argument they maintained throughout the 1980s.
Yeah.
Throughout the 90s.
So, let's play the clip.
Gonzalez is arbitrary. It is neither fair, reasonable, nor humane. Can this court do anything about it? This court concludes that it can. I order him released on parole by noon tomorrow, June 5th, 1981. Simply following the Mizet precedent seemed to Judge Shube incompatible with doing the right thing.
The first person released was a former medical student, and his name was Soro Gonzalez.
Here's Judge Shube talking about the case in the mid-90s.
I had a separate hearing for him, and he told me that when he came to this country, he expected to find justice, but he had not found justice. And I said, you'll get justice in this court. And I ordered his release. His attorney, who was a young woman named Deborah Abel, took the order releasing him out to Atlanta Penitentiary. It was on a Friday afternoon.
And I walked in, and, like, we're here to get Soro Gonzalez out. I waited and waited and waited, and they were just ditzing around. They did not want to release this guy. So I called Judge Shube's office.
She called me from the Atlanta Penitentiary and said, Judge, they will not release Mr. Soro Gonzalez.
I said, I can't get him out.
So I called the prison, and I spoke to the lieutenant who was in command. And I asked him if he had the order, and he said he did. And I said, well, you have an order to release Mr. Soro Gonzalez. I expect him released. He said, well, I have orders from Washington not to release anybody, no matter what the judge says.
I could hear him through the phone, and Judge Shube said, Sir, can you tell me what your name is? All right, and how do you spell your last name? And the guy said, what do you need to know the spelling of my name for? He said, well, I just want to make sure that when I issued the warrant for your arrest, for not following that order, I spelled it right.
I said, well, I'm going to send the U.S. Marshals out there in about 10 minutes, and they're going to pick up Mr. Soro Gonzalez, and they're going to pick you up. And you're going to spend the weekend in the Douglas County Jail, and then you're going to be brought before me for contempt of court Monday. He said, okay, I'll release him.
And finally, he and I walked out the door.
When Deborah Abel finally walked out with her client, Soro Gonzalez, he'd been detained for 379 days, and his release was a source of hope to the rest of the detainees in Atlanta.
At the time, the cell blocks had windows that opened, and word spreads pretty quickly in the prison, and everybody seemed to know that I was walking out with Soro Gonzalez. And so there were all these Cubans up there, waving like pillowcases or just waving out. And they were screaming, Santa Deborah! Santa Deborah! They're like, oh my God, this is like, it's a moment like no other in my life. And then we got to where the sponsors were, and wished him the best and said goodbye, and I don't think I ever saw him after that. But I knew he was safe and good.
And that's what it took to get the first one released.
May I say that the judge has an amazing drawl. It's really amazing. That story ends happily with Soror Gonzalez. I would say stay tuned, continue to listen. The podcast is about halfway through to hear what happens to the rest of the detainees. But I'd like to kick it over to my colleague Antonio to also engage us in a conversation about what it means to put together a podcast like this, what it means to do this kind of reporting.
Can I ask one? Can I have one thing?
Yeah, please, Nick.
Hello? Is it on?
I don't think so. Maybe
you want this?
Brianna's.
Hello? Incredible work. It just reminded me very strongly of something that I heard a couple times when I was in the process of reporting my podcast, and I never quite got it in there in the final product. But the idea that there are uncomfortable truths, right? And what we just heard, and what I was told in the process from a couple of people reporting is, like, Danny, what you're reporting on, like the origins of Chrome Avenue, the origins of indefinite detention, think of that like how we think of Guantanamo Bay. Because it's the same legal tradition in a way. I mean, Guantanamo Bay, there's a lot of Cubans here, there's a long history there, obviously. But the way that it's used by the federal government now is a place where laws don't apply. Like, American law does not apply. We have control over it. We're there. We have the American flag, but this is a special place where our laws do not apply. You're not in the United States. You can't give birth on Guantanamo Bay. I don't know if people know that. If you give birth, they put you on a boat and they send you off to give birth in the water, because we make believe that our values and our laws don't apply. And a lot of the early immigration stuff that we're talking about is like somewhat on the same belief. It's, you're not actually in the United States. We can do other things to you here. And it's just, it's hard to reconcile that with who we tell ourselves that we are.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for that, Danny. Let me kick it over to Antonio.
It's really great to be here and listen to what you're saying, and I really urge all of you to listen to these podcasts, because even though these clips are giving you a taste of how good it is, it doesn't nearly do it justice. I heard this Santa Deborah part as I was driving up I-95 by myself in the car the other day, and I was literally tears flowing down my face. It was that, because there's a lot more build up to that wonderful moment. So it's terrific, not just for South Floridians or for people or for Cuban-Americans, for anyone who's interested in human stories and in the issues of immigration and asylum. It's just a tremendously powerful podcast, and I can't wait to listen to the last few episodes. This segment is called The Art and Challenges of Podcasting. Podcasting has a growing footprint at the University of Miami. We now have classes in podcasting. I'm the faculty advisor for the Miami Hurricane, and the Miami Hurricane now has recently started a weekly podcast. So it's growing here, and so we wanted to talk a little bit about, for students who are here, and just in general for our edification, about podcasting itself. And I wanted to start kind of where you guys started off earlier, which is one of the things that struck me in the first episode, where you talked to Linda Calhoun and you say, it was 2015. And I remember thinking, like, oh my God, I worked on some long, stories in my career, but I never worked on something for 7 years. Did you guys envision a podcast from the beginning? And did you ever think it would take you this long to get it to come to fruition?
Well, I'll try to do this briefly, but we had worked on a story in 2014 and 2015 that took place in Selma, Alabama, about an unsolved civil rights murder. And we had worked on it to the extent that we knew there was really, really interesting stuff, but we didn't have a broadcaster lined up for it. And there was some ethical stuff, but really primarily some legal stuff about the things that we wanted to report, about invasion of privacy and how do you finger someone in a murder that's long been cold. I did lots of stuff that was like pretty intense. And we were just a little bit overwhelmed. It felt a little bit hard to imagine without a bigger support system than just 2 independent journalists at that time. And so we actually thought we'd find an easier story to work on, which is how we ended up finding this story, which then spiraled into, we actually worked on this, and this is why some of the folks in the audience we talked to in 2015, because we were working on this story back then, and pitched it to NPR. And in the process, this is a note to all you journalism students or anybody who wants to be a writer, we said, not only do we have this great story about the sort of roots of our immigration system and the Mariel boat lift, but we've been working on this, also we've been working on this civil rights cold case project. And NPR was like, wait a second, what's that story about? So we ended up essentially getting the backing of NPR to do that, which became our first season of the show. So when the first season did well and it was in release and they were like, we want a second season, we were like, haha, remember? We had worked on this Mariel thing. So that's how we sort of came in. That's the long, so we didn't actually work on it for 7 years. We worked on it pretty feverishly in 2015 and 2016 and then put it down really until, right after 2019 when our last show released, and then as we all know, the pandemic. And so we've been working on it pretty intensely for the last 2 years, I would say. So it has taken a very long time. But in terms of how we found it, I mean, we talked a little bit about that, but knowing whether or not it was going to be a podcast wasn't immediate initially. We both have background in filmmaking. Chip's a narrative nonfiction writer. I've made a lot of documentaries, and we love cinema and love that sort of feeling. And there's something very cinematic about podcasting, I think, or it can be very cinematic. We love music. You probably heard, I realized in listening with you all how much music is in the pieces. We have a composer that we work with. And I think that there's just a very, we think of storytelling, nonfiction narrative podcast storytelling as a very visual medium. Ironically, because obviously it's not a visual medium, but it's like little movies playing in our ears, basically. Podcasting is so intimate. Most people listen to it literally earbuds in their ears. It's that voice is inside of your head. So I think there's a sensitivity there, and it also in many ways, both Chip more so than me, but we both have a real love of great writing. We both have a writing background, and it is a writer's medium in many ways. So I think all those things really appealed to us.
You bring up sounds, and that was actually a question I asked the podcasting professor, to suggest a few things. He said, one thing I think that students would really be interested in is the choice. And Danny, please, pipe in too, and Chip, obviously, is the choice of sound. I mean, there were times where you were, in the podcast where you use a GPS talking to you about how to get around the nightmarish Miami traffic. So the variety of options are great there. So how do you think about what deserves to be in there from a sound standpoint?
Well, I'm going to answer that question, but first, when Andy said radio is a very visual medium, I immediately thought about, I can't remember if it's your first or second episode, but the barrel. Like, it's a haunting image that I can't get out of my head. First episode, and there's sometimes you get those. I mean, there's an episode of Serial season 2. If anybody hasn't listened to Serial, please. But season 2 of Serial, where she talks about a situation that it can't get the attention of the U.S. government, and she says it's a small fire smoldering, out there in the thing, and it's just like that immediately you're like, oh, I can see it now. I get it. I get the context for it. So in terms of sound, though, I think I think it's a taste thing in some ways, and we all, we work with a co-writer, and we all have different tastes. So we have to, when you collaborate, you've got to figure out where you all intersect. And I think I think we both agree there's a kind of happy medium. Sometimes if you overdo it with those sorts of things, it can feel gimmicky, it can feel put on, it can feel too orchestrated. And so I think we're actually struggling with this right now with our final episode. Like, to what degree do you avail yourself of those natural sounds that you got, ambi sounds, and that you got while you're out there reporting? They can really do a little bit, can go a long way to just establishing kind of where you are and sort of what the setting is for your reporting. We are both very interested, I think, as listeners and as readers and as viewers and also as people who make stuff, in process. And I think podcasting works really well for process, especially journalistic process, where I won't give anything away, Mirta. Thanks to Mirta, we embarked on a great sort of lark in the story that was so fun to do, and Mirta sort of launched it, and I think just revealing a little bit of that process sometimes can for an audience, I think, make it feel, they can feel the sort of overall arc of all that work you did without having to like drone on about it. In terms of 7 years, speaking, podcast trope is how long you've worked on the thing. It's we're like, oh, we got 7 years. We're going to say 7 years, which is not true. We didn't work on for 7 years, but.
Can I add something to that, because I know exactly what you're talking about, and I told Andy, but if there are any students, I don't know if there are there any students here?
There were some.
1, 2, okay. 3, great. So we often say not to use any anonymous sources for a variety of reasons that we won't go into now. But what they're talking about, they actually use an anonymous source in a very effective way. They just revealed that I was the one that tipped them off. They don't do that in the podcast. But I'm not an anonymous source, it's somebody else. But they describe.
We felt lazy if we just said, Mirta.
They describe the whole scene in the house, and you don't have to know who it is to enjoy that and to know it's a real person. And then they make a very good choice. They choose at the end to say, that he says, you can always come back to my house, basically, mi casa es su casa, the sort of thing that Cubans always say. And it gives such legitimacy to that encounter. You just know that they were there, that they're not BSing you, that there was a real human being there, that for whatever reason they can't name, but it's actually one of my favorite parts of the podcast. It's just very good.
Well, and the really nice thing about that moment is it's totally inconsequential. Like if it had been something consequential, we probably wouldn't have gone with an anonymous source. But because it ends up being a lark to some degree, we're allowed to sort of play it out to give the audience the ability to feel that sense of like what it's like to try to chase down a rumor for days and days on end.
Yeah, and if there's dead ends.
Places you in Miami.
Yes.
Very well.
Well, it is a very Miami.
Exactly. It is an interesting piece of the process for you guys, and shows in a way as we're talking about process. So let's talk about, this is a sprawling story where you're talking about, something that's extensive legal, personal issues. You have to go back in history really to the Cuban Revolution more than 6 decades back. Obviously the seminal event happened 43 years ago, but then you move into the 90s and all the way until today. You're also, geographically a sprawling story from Montana to Cuba, really. You go. So what are the advantages and disadvantages of a podcast for telling a story like this?
Yeah, I mean, it's nice because it is not cheap to travel all the places that we travel to. There is reporting costs for that, but it is, from a filmmaking perspective, from that being the other medium that we've worked in, it is a lot cheaper for the two of us to show up, rent a car with our microphones, and go report for a week or so. And we spend a lot of time in archives, like Brianna does, and a lot of time just requesting documents and reading and absorbing all that. That's not expensive time. So I think there's a way in which we're able to do a lot of processing of a lot of information over a long period of time that can then be consolidated into a handful of calculated reporting trips. So I think from an expense level, it's a little bit of a lighter touch. The other thing is with radio, again, I'm kind of referring this back to filmmaking, but with radio, there's a lot lighter touch going to someone's house and saying, I want to talk to you about something. It doesn't feel as invasive as a camera does for a lot of folks. This was especially true in our first season where we had people who did not want to talk about this period of history. If we had come in with cameras, we never would have been able to tell that story. But coming in with microphones is a little different. Still took a long time, but it's a little bit of a different process of engagement there. And I think that, again, going back to the sort of writer's medium thing that we feel so acutely about podcasting, the intimacy is always accessible there because of how light you are with the equipment, how little how little it costs someone besides their time to sort of spend time with you. They don't have to think about doing their hair, although I can't tell you, I'm sure Danny has this too, like how many times you go to an interviewer's house or call them and they're like, so it's just radio, right? Like there's this kind of hesitancy, like, yeah, right. So I think in that way, those decisions they don't drive what medium the story takes, but I think those are things we think about all the time.
Talking about radio, what do you think podcasting will mean for radio as we move forward in time? Because I talk about, if I get in a car these days for a long drive, it's either podcast or Apple Music. I don't even think about turning on the radio. Do you think it's going to hurt the radio business? Danny, maybe you have an opinion on that?
I mean, I think I've been in it long enough to know Because I started working at WLRN in 2011, and I left for a while and I came back. But I remember in 2011, there was a lot of fear that podcasts were going to spell doom, or satellite radio is going to spell doom.
But the growth has been phenomenal since then.
But there's still a very strong audience on terrestrial radio. I mean, I don't think it's shown that it's going anywhere necessarily. I mean, I think the difference in my opinion, between the two is, podcasts don't have as rigid formats as regular terrestrial radio, and in a lot of ways that's very liberating, right? You don't have to do a station ID every so often. You can just go a long stretch having a long conversation without having to cut to a break, and it frees up. What was that? You can swear. You can cuss. I mean, yeah, if you need to. But what that allows is, and it's something I struggle with sometimes when I'm cutting something for the radio. It's like you have to get it it's always a process of cutting. I have something that's 10 minutes long. I got to get it down to 4 minutes, right? And this really frees it up. But in doing that, it makes it better in a lot of ways, depending on who you're talking to, because we were talking about sound, there's different kinds of sound, right? There's the sound of opening a door, and you hear the door opening, or you hear the GPS or something like that. But the other sound, the most important one is the sound of people's voices. And, storytelling, just simple storytelling, it's the oldest art form that exists in the world. It's something that, without even thinking about it, we're fluent in this language. And when you find someone who's good at storytelling, what we do is write, right? We write things, but when you're interviewing someone, they're good at storytelling, just let them have it. Just let them take it on. And then in doing that, it's a very, you guys said visual, right? I tell people it's radio podcasting in some ways is a more intellectually engaging experience than video, because video you can be pretty passive. You could just sit back and you see the images. You don't have to think about it that much. But with the radio, when you're listening to someone tell the story, you are painting the picture in your own head. So you are part of the process. It's an interactive experience. And I think that's what underpins some of the popularity of podcasts. But some of that goes to the freedom of the medium, actually.
Yeah, well, let's talk about the popularity of the numbers. The numbers are kind of hard to come by, but there's a forecast says that the podcasting industry will be $4 billion strong by 2024. To put that in perspective, the film industry is only was about 7.4 billion last year. So it's incredible how big it is. Well, yeah, a lot of that is Joe Rogan, but other numbers. There are anywhere from 3 to 5 million podcasts out there. The growing at a rate of 20% per year, 28 million new episodes every year. So obviously, people are finding podcasts and finding them tremendously appealing. Why do you think? You've said a lot of it, and we've heard some of it, but what do you think is making such a difference for the listeners?
I think a couple of things. I think those numbers are both true, and I think it's partly just new people coming on, and so audience, I think there, what was the number you said?
28 million new episodes every year.
Podcasts. I remember a couple of years ago when we were talking about this, it was 800,000 podcasts, and now it's quadrupled or whatever it is.
Everyone started one in the pandemic.
And I think one of the beautiful things about podcasting is there's a niche podcast for everyone. If you, what's a stupid example I could think of? If you I like pens. I love pens. They're 1,000 podcasts about pens. There are podcasts about, what's your Joe Rogan joke you make? There's a podcast where somebody gives a daily update of the Joe Rogan show, and it's incredibly popular. So it's for people, I guess, who don't have time to listen to Joe Rogan, who then listen to the digest. I don't know. But so there are all these super niche podcasts. And so if you're into cats, there are podcasts about cats. You can go listen to those. And so we're both Alabama football fans. I can't tell you how many Alabama football We joked that for one of the clips we were going to play the 1993 Sugar Bowl instead of one of the clips from the show. That's when Alabama beat Miami. We can talk about that later.
Too soon.
Too soon. That's right. 30 years. But there are so many podcasts for every possible interest, and I think that's part of it. Is that you can find something that is super targeted to you because it's hosted by someone who cares about the things that you care about. I think for things like what we do, it's much harder. It's for general audience, and I think that in a way is good.
And how does the audience you are targeting affect your choices? Because it's really interesting. One of the things I found interesting in reading up on podcasts and things was that it's pretty much the opposite of the news business. The news business is an inverted pyramid, right? You've got all the viewers are up at the oldest age and the fewest viewers are down below. Podcasts are the opposite. The biggest audience is, it's a normal pyramid. You've got the 18 to 34-year-olds are by far the majority of listeners. About 50% of people that age listen to a podcast I'm not sure if it's every month or every week, while only 22% of those old people like me, 55 and up, who listen to a podcast that frequently. So how much does the audience play a role in your choices?
I'm curious what your answer is to that, just given that it was a Miami story in a lot of ways, but it's a broader story, but you centered it at Miami.
Yeah, I mean, for my podcast, how would I say that? I mean, I'm lucky because my outlet gives me a lot of freedom, and basically the editorial line is like, if you think this is interesting, like, please go for it, as long as there's something there, I mean, and to that point, like, the first thing I did was I made what we consider a long radio story. I made an 8-minute story, which was a very short version of the podcast, and I brought it to my editors, and they said, what are you talking about? Like, this is so much bigger of a story than what you brought us. And then I said, okay, let's build on it. And I think that actually, as a general rule, works for podcasts. Like, if there's something that's like a string you can just keep pulling on, every time you pull it, there's something more interesting, and there's something more interesting. For a narrative podcast, it's kind of what you want, a very simple, cut and dry question, or just, he said, she said, simple narrative. It's probably not going to be worth it. I mean, because as a medium, it works very well for nuance, right? I mean, it's like you can talk through things, you can hear different perspectives, and if you weave it all together, it'll be very engaging. You'll get something out of it, you'll think something you didn't expect. It can be surprising in a lot of ways. So, and I think, I'm still youngish, right? I mean, like, that's what I look for in a podcast.
Compared to me, you are.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I look for in a podcast is, let me listen to something that's going to make me interested, just give me something interesting.
And it was interesting to talk to Andy and Chip earlier about the process of a serial podcast over a number of weeks and how you have to kind of find a hook to grab the audience and keep them listening for the following week. I've got a ton more questions I could ask, but I think we're running a little long. Do we want to open it to the audience?
Yeah, let's go ahead and open it to the audience. I think there's going to be a mic somewhere, or we can loan one probably, but we'd love to take some questions from the audience.
I have a question, and I don't need a mic.
Okay.
Well, actually, we might need a mic for the camera. So let's.
I talk pretty loud. Are there any Mariel refugees still in prison of these groups?
So in 2005, there was a Supreme Court decision that disallowed the indefinite detention of non-citizens. I mean, I'm sure there's lots of ways in which the federal government and the Bureau of Prisons have skirted that, but to my knowledge, there's not anyone incarcerated still.
Well, there are people in prison.
There are people in prison, but not the way that this group of people. I mean, our biggest interest was the indefinite detention.
People in prison because they have been charged with other crimes.
Yes,
but
not people who are in prison as detainees in the immigration system.
Right, like
I think it's what is it, like 90 days or something? What's the?
It's 6 weeks.
Is it like 6 weeks? Yeah.
I would just make one. I think this question might bear some further digging. There's a historian named Christina Schull at UNC Charlotte, who's done some interesting work on the history of immigration detention with regard to Mariel. And she wrote an article for a special issue of a journal that I co-edited on the 40th anniversary of Mariel. And I think she would argue that there are. I mean, I think that there are some, at least few cases of folks who maybe after coming into the United States haven't become citizens, commit a crime, they're sent to jail, they become eligible for the revocation of their permanent residency if they have it, then become deportable. But if the Cuban government's not accepting you back, right, in theory they can't be left in detention. But she tells the story in this article of a guy who's has a blog and is sort of still in detention. So my sense is that the Supreme Court decision happened, but that there have still been some things falling through the cracks, for lack of a better way to say it.
Well, just to add on to that, in 2017, with the renewal of the migration agreement, this list that's at the center of our story was basically made a category, sort of ceased to be a list of 2,746 people and became a category of if you came over in Mariel and the U.S. was detaining you in immigration, they could send you back. But I don't think it's been as easy as just sort of saying, Cuba saying like, okay, send them back.
Right.
So.
Brianna, no, go ahead, Danny.
Just to follow up, on the ICE website, there's a data portal that I looked at just the other day, which is very interesting. Because it shares data about all the people that are in detention across the whole country, and it's pretty updated. They update it weekly, I think, and they have it by time period. So it's like how many people have been detained for a week or less right now, a month, etc. And the last tier is a year or longer. And last time I looked at it, there was a few hundred people that had been in immigration detention for a year or longer, which is not a huge number. But I don't know who those people are. Mm-hmm. But some people are still being very long-term held. I mean, I just don't know their particular cases.
I don't know if Brianna, if you want to chime in here, not to put you on the spot.
Oh, yeah, no, often the people who are held the longest are the people who have attorneys and are fighting the cases. And that's one of the kind of weird parts of detention, and it's always been one of the strange parts of detention, is when you find these sometimes when you find these really exceptionally long detentions, it's because they're going through rounds and rounds of appeals, and often, incarceration is used as a tool to try to get them to give up. It's a way to kind of dissuade people from undertaking these long legal battles, but that's probably who some of the folks are today.
Thanks. Yes.
Only a couple of points I want to share. First,
with the microphone, please, if you can.
I'm very glad of this thing that you have done and put to the ear of the public the real truth behind this injustice, indefinite detention of the Mariel refugee, and not only Mariel refugee, other immigrants of other nationality have suffered the same consequence, that they have been able to be released under the order of the Supreme Court. But we're not only the Cubans that we are held indefinite detention in the law. One point I want to share is that in March of 1980, 1 month before the Mariel, the Congress, and signed by the President, put in law what is called the Refugee Act of 1980. That Refugee Act changed the rules for related to refugee and political asylum. And that happens and affect very much to the Mariel refugee, the Mariel people. So the Mariel people never were able to adjust to become resident under the Cuban Adjustment Act. They have to pass 5 years later the Haitian and Cuban Adjustment Act to be able to release. I think that in the beginning of the process will be another program longer than the one, because in a few months, all the operation of the Cubans and Asian refugees changed 5 times from different government agencies. I was there. And you were talking about Chrome, and I have the guilty feeling that I was the one that opened Chrome North for the Cuban refugees. That is something that I always felt sorry. In that moment, Chrome South was for the Haitian, was handled by the INS. Then the operation of Chrome was handled by the Cuban Asian Task Force. But then they changed that to the State Department. And then the State Department took over. So you will have to do a long story of how all that thing affected the Cubans in the Haitian. Years later, the Cubans and the Haitian went to the same place, and they were held in Guantanamo Bay before they started using Guantanamo as a prison. And I was there I saw the conditions for the Cubans and the Haitians in the camp, and how the solution was different for the Cubans and for the Haitians. The Haitians were returned or forcibly returned to Haiti after Aristide came back, and the Cubans were allowed to come to the state. That was some point that I wanted to do.
Thank you. I don't know if anyone wants to respond or take another question.
No, thank you for that.
Yeah. I think we got a hand right here in the middle.
Thank you so much for coming through. It's very interesting that, we've come so far, with technology that now internationally wise, so to speak, we can listen to what has happened to, our people. And I just wanted to point out something in reference to an author of a book. Let me find it here. Her name is, I don't know if you've known of her, but her name is Kate Dupaz-Hawk.
Mm-hmm.
She has a book that's, it's named Florida and the Mariel Boatlift of 1980. She was invited to attend FIU as part of a panel a while back regarding the Mariel Boatlift. And what I loved about her, she was very straight to the point. And I met her after the event, and she had explained to me something that's very curious, that till today, our military is still guarding the tents or the places where the Mariels came through. They're still guarding it. So I asked her, how can that be? Why? And she said, for possibilities, for the purposes of martial law. So since you have broadcast, I think that it would be interesting if you would investigate towards that. And I can see why a martial law could occur because of the way that our country is heading. So thank you.
On that happy note, in the back over here. Thanks.
Thank you, Renee. Good evening, everybody, and thank you again for coming out to talk about this. I have two questions, but for time constraints, I'll just ask one and see if we can get around to the other one. I was very curious when you had mentioned the use of music and just having sound effects that kind of add to the work of this whole thing. Now, mind you, don't tell my professor, he's right here, but I'm just kind of like wondering in regards to the whole boat lift and the detainees and all that stuff. Do we see this in any way affect music and how it's perceived in musical media products during this time period?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think a lot of folks have done work on the influence of Mariel Cubans on American music and in Cuban-American music in particular. It's not something we knew a lot about. Our composer is actually based in Vienna. He's an American, but he lives in Vienna now. And we talked for a long time about the degree to which Cuban rhythms and Cuban sounds would influence the score. And I think we opted not to because it felt a little bit like cliched to a certain degree. It's not really the style of the rest of our storytelling. We are not Cuban, you may not be able to tell. So I think we intentionally sort of didn't dive into that as much as we might have otherwise. But if you have another question, we're happy to talk to you afterwards.
You've got a good voice. You should get in the podcast.
I did voice work in the past.
Yeah. There you go.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for the way you presented this. It's amazing, the professionalism of this podcast. It's the use of narrative, the use of music. It's really a great job in a very complex story. And one thing that talking about this topic, we cannot let this program go by without mentioning the name of Bishop Agustin Roman, of Miami, who played an amazing role in this whole thing on humanizing the story of people that were demonized by our own community to a large extent. When Castro was able to accomplish to make us play into his role, that the people leaving Cuba were not leaving because of the desperate situation inside of Cuba, but because they were bad people. And by doing so, he was trying to tarnish the success story of the Cuban exile community up to that point. And we unfortunately fell for it. And we kept calling them the Mariel criminals, when in fact, the number of criminals in that group, yes, there were some bad people, but how do you define criminal, as you so well say in the podcast? Another element was these were people that were not in the United States. When I became involved with this thing, I was chairman of the State's Hispanic Commission, and we held public hearings every month to find these were people that the majority of Hispanics in Florida did not have a vote at the time, so the commission was the bridge for representation. And one time we got a request from Mariel detainees in Tallahassee for us to go and hear their case. Out of a 15-member commission, I showed up because I was a chairman. But that was how little understood this. For the vast community, these were the criminals that Castro sent us. And when I sat down with them and I said, and they told me, we have been here now for 3-4 years after we pled guilty to minor charges in Miami. We were living under the expressway, and someone came and offered us if we took this back from here to Hialeah. Yes, we took the bag, and they arrested us. Then Janet Reno offered us a plea deal, a plea bargain. And for these individuals, Janet Reno thought that they would be followed the same way that the other Cubans had. You serve your sentence, and you're let go. Janet Reno had no idea that after serving their sentences, these people would be held indefinitely by immigration. And so when I sat down in Tallahassee at the prison with the detainees, I told them honestly, I don't think you're telling me the truth. And they said, if you don't believe us, go and talk to Bishop Roman. He knows our story. And that's what I did. And that's how I became involved in this whole process that ended with the peaceful negotiations after convincing the Attorney General, Edwin Meese, to establish a review process. That was our condition for entering the jails at the prisons in Atlanta and Talladega. And Cynthia Corso's here, and she was there I'm sorry, we entered at Atlanta and Oakdale, and Cynthia did Talladega, but it took that uprising for the review process to be established that eventually released 80% of the detainees.
Thank you.
I want to
please.
just respond to that. Thank you for that. That was troubling for a lot of reasons, but we needed to hear it. And it also just made me think of something that they were talking about earlier about, and I guess we've all been talking about it, about the reception in Miami and the hysteria almost. I mean, it's almost a case study of how media should not operate, and I'm very aware of that now that I'm in the media. I hope to God I would not do that. As part of the podcast that I did in the fact checking, I went back and I found an INS report, like an annual report from, I forget what year, it was 82 or 81, and they were 2 years on delay, I think, and they were giving all the numbers about what happened in Mariel. And what they found is that basically, yes, there was 125,000 people that came in. It was a few of them, it was like 5,000 or so, just off of memory, had criminal histories. But then it went deeper and it said, but a lot of the crimes were political crimes. You're talking about people selling something on the black market in Cuba. And we were holding that against people. And the media here was fear-mongering with people selling something on the black market in Cuba. And, you know, when I read that, it's like, I hope that we wouldn't do that. And that stigma lasted a very long time. You know, I was researching the other day, I sent it to Michael, just something completely different, and I came across an article in the Miami Herald, the late 80s, and it was when they were talking about returning some of these Mariel refugees who were in prison to Cuba under some kind of thing that Reagan was cooking up at the time. Mm-hmm. And it was at that time when a lot of Miami Cubans started to profess that they saw themselves in these refugees, because for a long time it was like, we're not the same, they're different. But when it came to the idea of we're gonna send them back years after the fact, that's when people started saying, hold on, you know, they're with us. And I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, thanks, Danny. The life of that stigma is long, and I think still with us in some. Yeah. Yes, but quickly, Mirta, forgive me.
Yes, I would be remiss if I don't mention a name here, and that is the name of Agrispina Manso Guevara, who was a woman who was held for 10 or 11 years without ever committing a crime in the United States or in Cuba. She was simply held because she couldn't get along with anyone. I think she was bipolar, but I'm not a psychiatrist. But when I met her, she had already been released in Louisville, Kentucky, to some religious organization that sponsored her. But not everyone who was held had committed a crime in Cuba or in the United States. Many were held, as the podcast points out, because they didn't have relatives. And then one thing led to the other, and then they found themselves in a federal penitentiary. Yeah. So that's one thing I wanted to say. And the other one is that, yes, there was a stigma, and there is a stigma. Still, I'm hoping that this podcast helps erase that stigma. But on the other hand, I would be remiss if I don't mention that the Cuban community here did help us. We would not have had the jobs that we had and the opportunities that we had it not been because there was already an established Cuban community here. And granted, not everyone was helped, but there were a lot of us. And the stories that were in the media were the stories of the so-called bad apples, but now the stories of the people who went to factories because they had cousins and aunts and uncles that owned factories or were co-workers that took them there and gave them jobs cleaning floors and driving trucks. And so there was a large number of people who made their lives here possible because there was a Cuban community here that did welcome them with open arms. Again, not everyone, but the majority of us were welcomed in that way. And I just wanted to say that because I think it's important to remember that the Cuban community has helped and continue to help the Cubans who are constantly arriving here.
Yeah, thank you, Mirta. I think that's a great note to end on, especially in a year of, once again, historic migration from Cuba, which will be a subject for another conversation entirely. So I want to thank all of my guests. Like many Cuban events, we've gone over time, so forgive us for sort of playing true to form, but thank you all for coming.